rewatch now, and this one will be available in a few days. We'll see. This time of the year, things get a little bit messy, but we'll try to get that up for you all as soon as we can. Let's see. The other question. Also, speaking of questions, there's a Q&A pod. So if you do have questions about the things that I'm talking about here, please put the questions up in there. Generally speaking, the webinar chat can get a little bit wild, a little bit messy, and sometimes I can lose questions in there. So if you could just put them up there. If I can't answer them today, I will. If I can't, I'll get in touch with you and try to get your email and send you an answer back that way. All right, let us get started. All right, here we go. Who is this guy on my screen right now? Well, as I mentioned before, my name is Mark Takata, and I am the Senior Adobe ColdFusion Evangelist. I have been here, oh goodness, almost 5 years. Next year will be 5 years, if you can believe it. Where has the time gone? And what exactly, what are we going to talk about? Sorry, I jumped ahead. I got all excited. Let's talk about what we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk about who I am, which I just told you. We'll skip past that. We're going to talk about what the query object is, okay? Because it's maybe a little bit weird. It's unusual for people coming from other languages because it looks like something else, but it has features and functionality and a shape that is not exactly what a lot of people are used to. So if you're coming from another language or you're starting off in ColdFusion new, this might be a little bit oddball, but it is extremely powerful. It is one of the core concepts inside of ColdFusion, one of the things that makes CF really, really great. So we're going to talk about what best practices and anti-patterns are for using query. It's not like anything, there's not one answer, there's not one tool for everything. So we'll talk about what query works for, and also we'll talk about a few things not to do with queries. We'll talk about some security concerns, things like that. And then we're going to dive into the built-in functions that Adobe ColdFusion has that have to do with the query object. Now, if you've been to my other foundations classes, this is going to be a little bit different. So the query object is actually kind of basic compared to some of the other things out there. You know, structs being a little bit of a outlier because structs can be a little bit weird as a hash table. But there's not a ton of things that you can do directly inside of the query object, but there's a lot of things that can affect it. And so we'll talk about that. We'll talk about how we can use it to access some of the different pieces of the query object to use in your application code. All right, so enough of that. We talked about me, blah, blah, blah. I've been doing this for 30 years. Oh my goodness, I'm old. I know a bunch of programming languages. And like I mentioned, I actually live in West Sacramento, not Sacramento. I lied. So Scott, haha, West Sac, best Sac. It's it's across the river from Sacramento. We are a different county. We're a different city. But yeah, for whatever reason, we stole Sacramento's name. So here we are. All right. Enough of that. Let's talk about the query object. So what's a query object, right? Like we know like the term query is asking a question or maybe SQL, like that's what you've heard of it. So in ColdFusion, a query object is a first-class citizen, just like a struct object or an array, and it's an in-memory representation of tabular data, essentially, right? So you might be familiar with like spreadsheets, there's columns and there's rows and things like that, right? Or a database, columns and rows, right? And in fact, most of you will be getting your query objects from a database. Now, I just mentioned spreadsheets and probably a few of you twitched. What's fun is ColdFusion actually allows you to query spreadsheets as though they were database objects and return a query from them. That's new in 2025, and it is really powerful and really awesome and very useful for dealing with, for example, business analysts whose entire lives are they're all Excel people, right? Like weird Excel people with their green logos. Anyway, so this allows you to have them be able to create stuff in spreadsheets, and you can query them as though it was a database object. It's really powerful and awesome. You should check that out. Now, something that most people think of when they're like, oh yeah, well, I've been doing this for real. I know what the query object is, Mark. It's an array of structs. Well, I thought that for a long time, and there might be video of me actually saying that. Turns out, oops, even the evangelist can be wrong sometimes. So, in fact, while the shape of a query is very much like an array of structs, very, very much, they look really similar. They are, in fact, a special type of Java class that was designed for ColdFusion, internally referred to as a SQL.query table. And if you dive deeper, it's a combination of like the Java vector class. There's all these other things that go into making it. Long story short, while it might look like an array of structs, it's actually not. And that's a good thing. That's actually a really good thing because it allows you to do a lot more things than you could do with an array of structs. So anyway, that's not to say that you can't convert an array of structs into queries. You can't do that, and I've done that a bunch of times. So why is that awesome? Well, because there's specific built-in functions and, more importantly, metadata that's associated with a query object, right? So things like record count. Now, you could figure out like, oh, what's the length and all that, but this is a shortcut, and as we all know, CF is awesome and powerful and rad, and I have it inked onto my body because it's fast and it allows you to get things done really, really quickly. It's why we all love it. So, how do you create a query object though, right? Well, there's a few ways, and I'll actually go and show you a little bit of code on this, but queries either implicitly are created when you use the CF query tag or query execute tag. And there's a little thing in there. For most of you, you've known like for many years now, I've been saying, hey, use script, like script is the new way of doing things. And I believe that, I truly do. I think doing pretty much everything in script, except for display stuff, which I think still tags are very powerful with, is the way to go. But my goodness, I just cannot get over how amazing and awesome the CF query tag is. It is the best tag in ColdFusion. I will die on that hill. It is just so it's just elegant and beautiful, and I do love it. So if you still use the CF query tag, don't be embarrassed, don't be ashamed. I do too. It's really, really awesome. I do use query execute when it makes sense. And now you could also explicitly create a query out of nowhere, out of thin air, using query new. And that's actually what I'm going to be doing here in my demo. So because I'm going to be providing all of you with demo code, you're going to see I've got a little query factory that I've created for you all to play with later. I don't really have a database to hit. So what I've done with that is I'm just creating queries and, out of thin air, just poof, right? But like 99.9% of what I'll be doing, that works just fine. In a few cases, though, it's a little bit different. And I'll get into some of the differences between doing a CF query-based query instantiation and just doing it using query new. Mostly, it just speaks to how awesome CF query is compared to doing it in other ways. But anyway. All right. So how do you create one like direct? Let's look at a little bit of code. So the first way is with the CF query tag. And like I mentioned, it's just really great. You're passing SQL in. And again, 99% of the time when you're creating a query object, you're going to be using SQL. You go into a relational database. That's usually how you're going to be pulling back this tabular data. As I mentioned before, there is a return type inside of some of the new spreadsheet and CSV tags that we released in 2025. That is a query object. So you can actually load a comma-separated value list into memory and convert it on the fly into a query object that you can then do pretty much all the things that I'm talking about here now. You can do to that query object as it comes back from CSV. It's very powerful, very awesome. You can then use it to like drop it into data tables and things like that. Really, really fun and awesome. I think I have some code related to that as well in my GitHub. Very important, parameterize your stuff, okay? I'm going to go into a little bit of detail later on about why to do that, and you'll get a little bit of a surprise because I'm sure all of you are thinking, well, oh yeah, obviously, Mark, we don't want SQL injection in our applications. You're right. but there's another reason to do it. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, on the other side, in the script world, there is an alternative to CF Query called Query Execute, and it's just fine. I don't want to, if you use that, that's totally cool. I do use that when it makes sense. If everything else is a script, well, I'm probably going to use Query Execute. Just there's differences between the two, and the main one that I find most useful is when you're doing like dynamic filtering of your data inside of CF Query tag. You can actually use CF if tags around the pieces that you want to be put in it or not. It's much more human readable. It's easier to go through. I prefer it. And if you're going to do that in the CF execute, in the query execute, you actually have to then build your SQL tag dynamically, and yeah, it gets a little bit funky. It's a little bit harder to read. It's a little bit harder to do. But hey, AI is doing everything for us these days, so it's probably easy. Kidding, just kidding. Yeah, I'm sorry. Anyway, so yeah, like what are okay? So there's parameters that go into it. You're passing SQL strings. You're doing params, right? Now, really important. This is something that a lot of people actually don't know about. So today we're talking about the query object, but there are different return types from both CF query and query execute. The default is the query object. That's what we're talking about today. However, if you want to, you can actually have it directly return JSON. You may not have known that. So if you're exposing an API and you don't need to do anything else to the query object, you just want to hey, I know what I sent in. I want to get back JSON. I'm just going to drop into an API to be consumed by something else. Well, you don't have to serialize or do anything like that after getting it. You can just have it output what you want, and it's pretty awesome. A little bit of a performance gain. For me, it's more about just readability and just having cleaner code. That's why I like that. All right, so if you are making stuff up from nothing, let's say you're building a query. So there might be a question here, like, why would you ever do this, right? If you can get queries from a database, one challenge is dynamic columns cannot be used with CF query param. Thank you, William. That's actually very true. Yeah, that is a challenge as well. So when might you use a query in memory if you can so easily get it from a database? Well, there's a few different reasons you might do this. So you might be getting data from disparate places, right? So you might be getting some of your data from a relational database, which one line of code, right? Like that's easy. But maybe you're also pulling in data from, like a NoSQL database, or as I mentioned, a CSV or something where it doesn't make sense to, well, in the past, you would have had to actually create a query out of nothing, but we fixed that. But let's say you're getting it from user input or something else, right? And you need to maybe union those or do something else between the two queries. You somehow have to like query the two things together. Well, this is how you would do that. And instead of doing something where you're mixing different object types, you can actually use two query objects together and make it a little bit easier. Also, if you're pulling in disparate data sources but have one processing pipeline, and you want to sort of keep that clean and just always, you don't want to be like, well, if it's this, it's an array, it's this other thing. This is another way that you could do that so that you can kind of do your ETL stuff up here and then keep your workflow and outputs a little bit cleaner. So how do you do it? You use the query new function, as I mentioned. You put in a column list, a column type list, and then your row data, if you've got row data that's going into it. Big recommendation here. Okay. In CF query, it actually can pull the data types automatically. It knows what it's getting. When you're creating a query new, it doesn't know what the types are. And what's going to potentially happen is it's going to do an inference. It's going to try to like figure out It usually does it on like the first 50 rows or something like that. And it can guess wrong. It's not perfect, but more importantly, there's a cost to it, right? There's a processing cost. And just me personally, I prefer to give it the data that it needs, right? Like I know ColdFusion is a duck type language, but we also, there's type safety that you can put into it to a degree. And for me, that makes sense, right? You want to, as much as possible, do defensive programming and make sure that your stuff, runs more often than not, right? That's probably pretty important, I think. And so anyway, that's important. So you can also create an empty query, right? And just add columns to it later, columns and rows later. And then you've got functions like query add row and query set cell. And we'll talk about those down the road when we go into the factory that I've got set up. And also, as I mentioned earlier, array of structs. So if for whatever reason you've got an array of structs that has come from somewhere, I don't know. Maybe someone has an example. I don't have one right now, but maybe there's an array of structs that you built from something. You can actually create and populate a query from an array of structs. So, because they do have similar shapes after all. All right. So, gotchas and other things. So you can use numbers by their row number to access them. So that's actually kind of useful. So for example, your query name, column name, and then the row number. So that's an access pattern if you need a particular thing and aren't just like vomiting your stuff to the screen. And that's usually what we do, is usually we just like drop everything to the screen and then pull what we need. Type handling matters, okay, for queries of queries. So Q of Qs require column metadata for data types. Most of us don't know that because we are almost always dealing with queries that have come from CF query and CF or query execute, and those automagically provide those for us. So we've never really run into that problem. The first time you try to do a query of queries on a query new created query, it may not do what you want it to do. It might break. So yeah, it's important to kind of do that. Like I said, CF inspects the first 50 rows or so to infer types. But yeah, if it does it wrong, you might have to cast, which is a whole thing. So this is a weird one. And honestly, I don't know if anyone has actually run into this. I have not. But if you populate date constants into a query new query, that they're stored as strings until the query of query runs, at which point they're converted. That's weird. I don't know. I don't know why. Again, that's a processing cost. So, keep that in mind as you're going along. And query set cell behavior actually does type validate. So they're not just going to blindly assign stuff in. All right. So when should you use a query object or a query of queries? I mean, a lot, actually. That's great. It's a great object. Again, like I said before, it's one of the core tenets of ColdFusion. ColdFusion was originally designed to take data from a database and display it on a screen, right? That was what its raison d'etre was. Its entire reason for being was to pull data, and that data was pretty much from the beginning set in as a query object, right? But specifically, things that are like report or UI or tabular are the things you're going to want to use a query object for, right? So you're going to go out, you're going to maybe pull something from a service, whether that's like a database somewhere that's holding data for, I don't know, your insurance company or health company or whatever. You're going to use a handler to do all the manipulation of it, filtering, whatever, and then you're going to drop that into a view. Like that pattern is the optimal place for using a query object, just generally, right? Pretty much anytime you're hitting a DB is a really good time to do that. Now, The other thing is query of queries, and query of queries have been sort of a controversial object, I guess, in history. Everyone's always fighting to have the fastest query of queries, right? Like every time someone announces that they're the fastest now, like someone else comes and says that they're the next one. Bottom line is, query of queries are pretty fast. And why is that? Well, because what you're doing is you're querying something that's in memory versus making a database call. Now, here's the truth for you. If you ever have a performance issue with your database-driven application, look to the database as the slowest part. Databases are several orders of magnitude slower than anything else, unless your code is like so horrible. It's significantly faster with some caveats, and I'll mention that in a little bit. Svetlana actually just mentioned where, with where clauses and things like that. Like, yes, it can get a little bit funky, and this is where, as a developer, you have to make these decisions. Context matters too, and I'll mention that. William asks, is there a list of what SQL clauses are allowed on QFQ? William, that depends on which database you're hitting, right? Because that's what that's talking about, is that some of the things that you might be able to do in one database might not be available in here, and there's an infinite number of databases. So for the most part, pretty much anything you can do in SQL Server, you can do in a QFQ-ish, right? So that's what that's meant. But you're reading ahead, William. What are you doing? All right. So what is the typical flow for a QFQ? So generally speaking, what'll happen is you'll have a query that pulls data of a certain type. Now, hopefully you're filtering. Don't just dump everything, and please don't do, like star queries, because no, you're not invited to my holiday party if you use star queries in your production databases. But maybe you've filtered down some stuff and you find that you need a subset of that, right? The query already exists. It's already in memory. It's already being used. Instead of doing an entirely new query, going out and pulling yet another thing into memory, you can actually go and just query this filtered query for the subset that you need and do a QFQ on that. That will have a significant performance increase. Generally speaking, again, like caveats all over the place, lots of asterisks here, but generally speaking, in most applications, yeah, that's going to be faster. DB trips are slow. DB trips are expensive, right? Now, here's the big caveat. Here's the big one. QFQ is ideal for, this is a big range, right? 5,000 to 50,000 rows is a huge gap. And again, it all matters where your DB is, how big it is, how big the data is, the performance of your machine that's running, ColdFusion. Test it. Performance optimization matters, right? It really does. And again, like, how complex is your query, right? Now, at some point, performance again is going to become an issue when things are big enough and complex enough, and you may eventually need to move to something like stored procedures, right? Doing everything in the DB. Generally speaking, you want to do as much on the DB as possible before pulling it in to spread the load out, right? That's just a good architecture thing. But again, like it all matters what your application looks like. And then again, combining disparate sources, QFQ can do joins and unions across results from different spots. All right. Anti-patterns. Fun stuff. Okay, when should you maybe think about not using queries or QFQs, things like that? Very large data sets, right? Here's the thing that I mentioned earlier. Paul Thomas asked, doesn't everyone already do everything in stored procedures? I can't remember my last ad hoc SQL in prod. Yeah, Paul, you'd be amazed. You'd be surprised. There's a lot of folks that still use just SQL in their code. And there's a lot of ways to make the performance pretty close, right? So, and again, like, remember, not everyone uses SQL Server. Not everyone uses things where stored procedures are sort of the default thing that you're doing, right? So, yeah, they absolutely exist. They're definitely out there. Okay, anti-patterns. So as I mentioned, big data, right? If you've got just giant data, just don't pull the whole thing down and then filter it later in CF. It's just a bad idea, right? I mean, your server's going to have limited memory, right? And Q of Q, again, it's memory limited. So, and it's not the range is not infinite. Here's one, and this speaks to what Svetlana said, is when the database should be doing the work, right? So complex join, lots of aggregation, indexing, things like that, optimization, right? But yeah, like Q of Q is a great tool, but you got to use the right tool for the job. And this, again, is where, as a developer, as an architect, that's where you have to use your experience and knowledge to figure out which is the right time to use it and which is not. Right. The other thing here, and this is kind of important, is like when data is changing all the time. And this also speaks to caching, right? So there's a little bit, obviously, like Q of Q is not caching, but when you're pulling something from a master query and using that instead of going back and getting more data, well, that data potentially could be stale, right? You're using the thing that you've already pulled down. So context matters, type of data matters. If it's something that you're pulling down data once a day, right? So, for example, a great pattern in insurance is we do a lot of bulk loads in the middle of the night, aggregate them all, ETL them all, put them all into a database for use during the rest of the day by all of the users. In that case, yeah, you're fine. That data is probably not changing if at all, right? The user input is going to maybe potentially change it. And then during the next bulk things during the night, like that'll get written back to the other DB, we'll pull the new data, blah, 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 and everything will get taken care of, right? But if it's like a game or something where it's just constantly going, or like chat or something that is just updating all the time, maybe not the best idea. And mentioned earlier, SQL feature mismatches, right? If there's a subset that is not being supported that you need, well, there you go, right? Then don't use it. And then, yeah, this I mentioned earlier, the type defaults. Okay, so the parameterization thing, here's a fun little thing, and I think this is still right, but maybe SQL got smarter. I don't think it did, though. So I mentioned earlier that you need to parameterize all of your inputs that are going in for safety, right? So you're not getting SQL injection happening. But there's another reason, and this is actually the reason that I parameterize everything going into specifically my SQL server, including things that I'm creating. So for example, if for whatever reason I needed to make a timestamp and I didn't want to use the DB timestamp, I actually wanted to do it on ColdFusion and drop that in as a date. Well, like, why would I parameterize that necessarily, right? I'm creating it. There's no danger of that getting injected. But every time that SQL Server runs, it creates an execution plan, right? If what it's seeing is new. If what it's seeing has been done before, it caches that plan and runs significantly faster, 10x plus. If you don't parameterize that field, it thinks that field is new every single time. So make sure that you're doing it on all your inputs. I have seen this take an application from taking 1 or 2 seconds to return a page to like milliseconds. Like it can be like, this was a really bad query. So there was a lot of fixing that it could do, but that change made a huge difference in performance. So There you go. All right. Who wants to check out some code stuff here? Let's see. Boop. There we go. All right. So this is my CFML queries factory, and you will all have access to this code. How are we doing on time? All right, I'm about halfway through here. This will be on my GitHub, and you'll see a post once the video comes up. I'll go ahead and do a post and probably a blog post and link over to this, so you'll be able to get it. All right, so here's what this code does. This just creates a sample little query, and this is using query new. So that's important here. This is not going out to a database. So there's some limits with things like metadata and things like that that are happening here. As much as possible, I'm trying to mitigate that, but keep that in mind if you want to end up using this code. And by the way, all this code is available for you to use if you want it. I decided to create some ice cream store daily sales because everybody likes ice cream. And there's non-dairy options here for those of you that have problems with dairy, so you're all set. All right, so let's start off. The first thing we're going to talk about is get metadata. All right. So this is actually really, really useful to pull down when you're trying to figure out what the contents of a query might be, right? In some cases, and I know I mentioned like never to use star, right? But there are times, and they're rare, but there are times when you might not actually know what you're getting back from a query in terms of columns, right? You almost always never know how many rows you have necessarily, right? But you may have some place that like, oh, there's like new columns that are added or whatever. And so you can actually use this to grab the contents. And so what this is up here, this is actually what you get back, right? So it's an array of structs. Array of structs, right? And it shows you things like case sensitivity, right? It tells you the name and the type name and the number of rows, right? So you could theoretically go through and figure out, you know, there's 4 columns, right? This is the names of the columns that you're getting back. Very, very useful, right? So I've actually used this to create a dynamic data table creation application where I could just take any query and drop it into a tabular display on your screen. Don't have to know what the columns are. Don't have to do anything like that. You can just grab the column names, put them as you know, at the top of the column, and drop all the data in it by looping through. Very, very useful occasionally, right? But it's nice to know this data. All right. Another thing that you may want to know is whether something that's coming back from a data return is a query, right? So in this case, I'm testing the current session query, and thank goodness it is, or I would be very upset with myself for not creating that. But you never know, like you might have to, there might be something coming in, and this is actually a good defensive programming thing to figure out like what the thing is that's coming through. Sometimes you can use this to test for errors, right? If you're doing if down the line someone is wrapping things in a catch, and so the application is just like still running, but the thing that it returns back is not a query. Well, you can catch it here. Sorry, pun not intended, or maybe it was. But that's one way of doing things. Now, check this out. An empty query is still a query, okay? And this is actually an important thing. If you're creating query objects dynamically, generally speaking, when you pull back a query from CF query, like it's fine. You're pulling one query, it's a thing. If you're creating a bunch of queries in memory to use, for example, like in a chatbot application or, you know, AI or something, right, where you're just constantly like throwing stuff in there using query object, maybe, you know, getting rid of it. Well, getting rid of it is not the same as emptying it, okay? An empty query still takes memory. if you have a few million empty queries in memory, just like arrays, just like structs, they still take up space. And you could potentially run into things like memory problems. It's essentially a memory leak that you're creating yourself. So keep that in mind. You do want to actually delete the query, get rid of it, kill it, whatever, the right way instead of just emptying it out and blanking it. All right, so let's say you've got a query that returns back some stuff, and you've got another column you want to add into it, right? Now, you could potentially do some, magic with it, with SQL or a query of queries or whatever, but you can just use query add column, and query add column will do exactly that. So let's say I want to add, let's see, ice cream name, let's see, I don't know, like store name. And I'm going to say it's a varchar, sure. And I'm going to go ahead and add it. And there you go. So now I've added a column to this query called store name. And I think that actually, yes. So that actually did that to my in-memory. That actually did that to my in-memory one. So I'm going to go ahead and clear it out and start again. Okay. In a similar way, if you've got a row that you want to add, you can also do that. So you don't have to, so let's say you've got a query and you want to maybe use that query to hold a bunch of data before then writing it back. You can use that query to write back stuff. Or you know that you're going to add stuff without having to go back and write stuff to the database. Maybe it's like temporary stuff, whatever it is. You just want that query object in memory to hold more rows. So you can actually use this to create more rows. Now, I'm just adding this stuff in there just for visual sake. Oopsie. Hold on. Yeah, so here you can see I've got some blank rows that were added. Now, there you go. So you can add blank rows and then you can populate those rows afterwards. Okay. This is a fun one. And at first I was maybe a little bit hesitant whether or not to actually show this. Query convert for grid. Now, maybe you still use CF grid. Probably not, though. It's a very old thing. It's probably something we'll eventually remove, right? It uses old code. And there's better ways these days to actually do this, right? Like, for example, there's lots of JavaScript things that you can just add an API endpoint to and just paginate and do all that. I actually have some code with Grid.js, I think it was, that just, very, very auto-magically pulls stuff in and displays it on your screen. But it isn't totally useless. So if I take this and actually drop it down, you can actually get it. You can actually get a little bit of output that you can then, you get a struct with a query that's inside of it that includes all of the data plus a row count, right? So you could theoretically use this to populate your own stuff. Probably not that much more useful than just dropping it down into tables or whatever you're going to use to do it. And again, you're probably going to use a JavaScript, but I just did want to mention that this is still in there. It has some minor usefulness, to be honest, but it's still available for you to use. Anyway, yeah. All right. Let's say you want to delete a column, right? And this is deleting it out of the one in memory. It's not just hiding it, right? but for whatever reason, you just don't want that column to exist anymore in memory. So I don't know. Let's say we don't really care about the stock remaining. Who cares? We've got lots of stock remaining, or that just doesn't matter for what I'm going to be doing here. Now, theoretically, you should probably, change the query in the first place, maybe, but who knows? Maybe this query is being used for something else first, and then you got to do it here. I don't know. Whatever it is. So there you go. You can actually use query delete column, and it's query name and column name to delete, and there you go. It's been removed from the column in memory. So now it's taking up a little bit less room, performance optimization types of things. All right. In the same way, you can also delete rows from a query, right? And again, this could be useful for having a display and not having to go back and change things from the database. Maybe you're doing something just during the session, right? And you don't want that to get written back either yet or ever at all, but you still need it to be in some sort of object. Well, let's go ahead and let's delete row 13. There you go. Delete row, 12 and 11. And there you go. So now I've deleted those. And if I go back here, you'll see they're gone. There you go. Easy peasy. Something a little bit more complicated. So a lot of us know that if you use CF output and specify a query, it automatically or automagically does a loop inside of itself and outputs all of the stuff to screen. Very, very cool. Very, very useful. But what if you need to iterate inside of a query and run a callback against everything that runs row by row? That's query each. And query each is really, really powerful, very, very useful. It's kind of like a for each or in JavaScript, right? And so you're going to specify the query, the callback, and also this supports parallel processing, right? So if you've got a lot of stuff that you're doing here, you can actually use parallel processing just to spread the load out a little bit, but it's very, very, very useful. So let's see. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to convert all of the text values to uppercase and output them out. So there you go. We've got vanilla, chocolate, all of that. So essentially what this did is, sorry, one second. Sorry, I was going to sneeze. I didn't want to sneeze on all of you. Anyway, so there you go. And this is incredibly powerful, like one of the most powerful functions. I use this all the time when dealing with queries in places where I'm not just dropping stuff to the screen, but instead using that query data in some way to ETL it or do whatever you want to do. I was going to say filter, but there is something for that, and I'll get to that in a second. First, we're going to talk about query execute because I did mention that. So this is the script version of CF query, and pretty easy. You're passing SQL in params. I showed you the code for this earlier. I don't have to go through with that, but query filter is kind of also useful. It's similar to query each, except that the callback that you're doing is creating a filtering for what you're doing. It's creating a sieve, basically, and returning back a new query. So this is important here, that this is actually dropping a query back to you with the rows that match that filter condition, right? So let's see. Let's do anything with 50. Oops. That may be everything. Yeah, that was everything. Anything higher than, let's say, 300 anywhere. So only 3 of them had total sales that had that. And in this particular case, as you'll see in the code, I'm actually filtering against all the things. I'm testing whether it's numeric and all of that, right? But you can put any callback you want into here to filter back stuff. So now, could you do that with query each? Yeah, absolutely. You could do this with, a bunch of different ways. But with CF, what we're trying to do is to give you tools that are, very effective, have good developer experience, are easy to read, right? This is going to use less visual code, so it's a little bit like easier to maintain as well. Yeah, it's a really, really nice feature. Okay. If you want to grab a row from a query object, right? That's something that I think a lot of us do a lot, right? We go out and we want the 5th or the last or whatever query row from something, and I just want that data to do who knows with, probably forms. Like there's a form and it was holding the data. I want to refill that data into the form so maybe that person can edit it, right? Here's a way that you can actually do that with a query object that's in memory instead of going, because remember, like if you're just going back and forth in the DB and like constantly getting stuff back, potentially a performance issue, right? So let's say I want, row 6. There you go. That's row 6, right? Rocky Road. And it returns back a struct, right? So you notice the order, as I mentioned in the previous talk about structs, structs are by default unordered. And that's what you're getting back here. All right. So query get results. This is an interesting one. This one gets back all of the metadata and the query result itself from a query. Now, you'll notice something here. The result of query get result on our query that we've had in memory here is null. Why? Well, that's because when you use a query new, in this case, that's the return that comes from that. You actually can only use this on stuff that comes from a query that has come from a database. Now, what would it have looked like had this been a query from a database? Something like this. It would have given you the record count, the columns, and then the actual data that comes out of it. So in a way, kind of similar in some ways to a combination of get metadata and the setup for grid thing. Pretty useful, maybe, right? There's things that you could absolutely do with that data. I don't know that I've ever used that actually in an application in Anger. Query key exists. So this tests whether a column or key exists in a query object and returns true if it does, false if it doesn't. So let's say I want to check for ice cream name. And check it, and sure enough, that column exists. What about ice cream flavor? Probably a better name for that. And that does not, right? So this is a way that you can do a little bit of defensive programming to see if a column is still existent inside of your memory object. Make sure that you haven't removed a column with with the function that removes columns, right? And keeps it from crashing when you try to exist something. All right, query map. This is a newer thing that we've added. This, if you are in JavaScript, you probably are very familiar with like filter, map, right, reduce, things like that. Those are very common member functions in JavaScript, and so we've got something like that for query. So this just this takes a callback function and it just auto-magically applies it to every row of the original query. So it's kind of similar to query each in a way, right? But it actually applies it to the query itself, I believe. So there you go. Convert all values to uppercase. So this is the original query here. And then here is the mapped query with everything in uppercase. So I'm actually curious if that, forgot whether I actually created a new one or not. Hold on. I didn't. Okay, I created a new one so I could show you the old one. Anyway, yeah, it's fine. All right. Query new we talked about creates a new query object. You can specify column names and data types. As I mentioned, that's important for things like Q of Q. You should probably do that if you can, right? If you know what they're going to be. Just good programming to set types. It doesn't take too much time. Query reduce. So this is an accumulator. All right. So this is something that allows you to take all of whatever thing and return back results. So when might you use this? Well, you might use this for total sales, or you might use this for grades, right? Something like that. So in here, yeah, I can like find the max numeric value in here. That's probably going to be 360. Yeah, 360. So the highest sale was 360, right? And again, I'm checking just for chuckles. I actually was checking every single one of these, but you could absolutely just check only in the total sales or only in the quantity sold, however you want to do it. And the return value that you get back is just going to be that one thing. That's why it's called reduce. You're reducing it down to one value. All right, so let's say you want to set a cell. Now, this might be something that you are that you're used to in dealing with spreadsheets, right? So spreadsheets, we think of this way and this way, right? You've got coordinates. You've got your X and your Y, and then you're going to set a cell at this particular thing. Well, you can do that with a query here as well, right? You can figure out, which column you want and which row value, and you can just set that to be a thing. So let's say, I don't know, our quantity sold on strawberry actually was 45. So we're going to type quantity sold. Actually, wait, sorry. I'm going to add, let's do this for 45, and 3 is the row because that's strawberry, right? I'm going to go ahead and set that cell, and there you go. It actually set just this cell to be that value, right? Very useful. And again, we're doing this in a way that's not actually changing anything in the database, right? We're just changing the query object's values for people to use maybe in their display, in their dashboard, right? Things that are happening. You might use one master query to have all your dashboard stuff coming from, and then have it being changed from other disparate sources. Things like that definitely work as well. So that's just one way that you could use that. Right. Query sort. We all have used this, right? This is pretty common. This allows us to resort a query without having to requery the database with a new order by. Pretty basic. I'm just going to go ahead and resort the. Oh, wait a minute. What did I do? All right. Well, that's broken. Sorry, guys. This worked yesterday. God bless it. All right. Sorry. I'm not sure why that's not working. But in any case, it's you do the query, you do the sort type, and the sort order. All right. Quoted value list, a comma separated list of quoted values from a single column. This is a good way to. Oh, why is none of my. Oh my gosh. Ending on a strong thing. Did everything at the end of this break? Everything at the end of this broke, of course. Oh my goodness. All right. Well, sorry about that, guys. I don't know why that's all breaking. The last 4 things, all these things worked before. Anyway, we can go over what the things are. So value. When might you use a value list? Well, you might use a value list when you're going to use a functions for built-in functions for lists, right? Because if you remember from my original foundations class, lists are a first-class citizen in ColdFusion. There's tons of functions. I think there's 38 different built-in functions for using lists. So this is a way that you could take that and drop it into a list function and display it in a particular way, add it to something, ETL it, look for repeats, all of the different functions that are in there. You can find that foundations class online. Value array, kind of the same thing, right? So you can actually take that column and drop it into an array and use a bunch of array functions. And yeah, the difference here is it's quoted values from a single thing instead of just the values in a query. Okay, sorry about that, everyone. I don't know why the last things. It's always the last things in my stuff that break. I don't know. I test this the night before and then things go nuts. Anyway, I will fix that before it gets up online. But we are at time. Got 3 minutes. If folks have questions, if you've got some ideas, if there's something that you've always wanted to have in the query object, have the query object do. I have a great question from Zoltan. So Zoltan asks, in the documentation for CF query, there's a bunch of different return types, right? There's array, JSON array, query struct, JSON struct. So Zoltan's asking what the difference is between JSON array and JSON struct. It's a really, really good question. The difference is that JSON struct, I believe, is the one, returns back a struct with metadata about the query and then another set of actual data return as the JSON. So I got to check which one of those. I always forget which one it is, but one of those basically returns back a combination of the two, including metadata. That metadata is like, what the column names are, how many things are in it, and then it also creates the other thing too, which is the actual API. So if you're accessing that, you have to know to access the thing that you're pulling back. Okay, so that's the difference between the two. I don't really tend to find that I have a lot of need for the one with all the metadata, unless again I'm actually dumping that into dynamically into a grid of some kind in JavaScript at the other end, and I need to pass in things like, well, what are the actual column names? What's the length? What's if I'm looping through something, right? Like that's actually really important. But generally speaking, yeah, JavaScript kind of does that all for you, right? It's like, here's an API with JSON, go for it. But yeah, occasionally you do need to like drop in, like if you don't know the columns, you may have to like loop through and pull that stuff back. So that's the difference. Eugene asks, what is the URL for recordings? Absolutely. Let me drop that in. It is HTTPS. YouTube.com/Adobe ColdFusion/videos. There you go. That is all of the videos, and that's not just my videos. Those are videos from a bunch of community members as well that have done videos at our various events that we've done online. So CF Summit Online, which actually there's another one coming up in January. So that's going to be fun. Make sure that you go and join that. A lot of the talks that happened in Las Vegas in September are going to be happening again. So if you happen to miss going to Vegas, You can catch a lot of those, and a lot of them have been updated because, it's been a few months, so things have changed. A lot of this stuff was on AI, so some of the things are just completely different now, right? Different models, different LLMs, different things, different methodologies. So definitely don't miss that. Yeah, it was fast. I know. I was like, oh my gosh, how is it 11 already? Crazy fast, crazy fast. Well, thank you all for coming. Definitely appreciate you. And I hope everyone has an amazing and safe holiday season. Stay warm. There's lots and lots of crazy weather coming to a lot of people. Please be safe. Don't take chances out there. There's snow and rain and wind and all sorts of madness happening, including here in Sacramento. We've been under a flood watch since last Saturday. So it is pretty wild. So yeah, everyone, please enjoy this time of the year. It's beautiful. Have a very happy and safe new year. And I will see you all next year for new, fun, cool stuff. And I'm definitely having another talk in January. So stay tuned for that. It will be another foundation series. And I'm not sure what I'm doing in January yet. Thinking about maybe talking about scopes. Maybe. We'll see. We'll see. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and hop off for just a second to stop the recording, and then I'll come back on if you want to chat for a little bit longer.